Hey everyone. As you probably know, I'm Josh Castle, and I've been the producer of this podcast since it launched in 2020. However, as of today, Ryan Kessler is stepping into the role of producer. You already know Ryan because he's been our fantastic editor and audio engineer for almost 5 years. As I depart from the role, I just want to say a big thank you to Spencer, Ryan, Janesa, Rochelle, and the rest of the We Amplify team, Liam, Igor, Uri, Alexandria, Gayla, Jennifer, Miles, and everyone else who's worked on the show over the past 5 years. I've enjoyed working with you all so much, and I look forward to seeing how you all grow and improve the show going forward. Also, listeners, I want to say a big thank you to you, too. I really appreciate all the feedback you've given us over the years, the questions you've asked, the nice comments you've left, and all the ways you've helped us to become a better show. And now, I hope you enjoy the episode.
Kristian, welcome.
Thanks a lot for having me on the podcast, Spencer.
What inspired you to work in climate change? And then why did you decide to leave working in climate change to work on AI?
So I think what inspired me originally was the idea of utilitarianism and caring about all beings, including beings in the future. And in order to actually reduce global risks, we need to coordinate globally. A lot of issues like climate, for instance, but also AI and nuclear are all global issues, and we need to learn how to govern globally. And climate change was that one domain that I first of all felt passionate about, but where there was actually momentum around global governance more than 10 years ago. So I sort of felt like I wanted to crack the formula of global governance. So that's how I went into climate to begin with.
Did you feel at the time it was sort of the highest impact thing you could do, or was it kind of a balancing act between impact and passion and learning?
That's a great question. I never felt like climate in and of itself was the most impactful cause area, but I did feel like global coordination and global governance was the most impactful cause area. But that has sort of never been a standalone cause area. And climate was sort of, I think, the domain where there was sort of most momentum around governing it globally.
Yeah, I can see why climate would be a really good use case, because it's so important for large countries to be able to coordinate in order to combat climate change. Because, if the US were to do it, but they couldn't get China and India on board, or Europe were going to do it, but they couldn't get the US on board, right? It's just not going to be very effective.
Exactly. And it's this massively hairy problem because fossil fuel is everywhere, and it's so entangled into our world economy. And also I felt like it was an area where long-termism was sort of almost the default. There is not very many areas within policy where people are actually passionate about the far future.
Although many climate change activists talk about climate change as sort of an incoming disaster, that it's going to create catastrophes in our own lifetimes, and that's not just about the future.
Well, yeah, that's true, but it's still future from a policy perspective. I think politicians are sort of incentivized to win the next election and have a next good election cycle, which might be, 4 years long. And climate change is still, several decades. So it's more long term than most policies on average.
And before we get into your transition into AI, do you feel that climate as a field has made progress on governance and how to get governance cooperation and achieve real goals there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it has made a lot of progress since I started working on climate. So, for instance, having the Paris Agreement many years ago, but also more recently, all countries agreeing to phase out fossil fuel. I mean, it's a monumental thing to get all countries in the world, more or less, to agree on one thing. But also in terms of building standards, something that I'm just incredibly passionate about, building standards for calculating carbon emissions for enterprises, and more or less making those standards the default and a legal requirement across multiple jurisdictions.
So what is this agreement where countries have all said they would phase out fossil fuels.
So that's essentially like an extension to the Paris Agreement. So that was signed back, I think, 2 years ago in the United Arab Emirates. And I've actually been a part of the Swedish government delegation to COP for multiple years. And, some years are sort of quite slow, not a lot happens. But that year, they actually agreed to phase out fossil fuels. And then obviously like the timelines and the like level of ambition for different countries are completely different, but they all agree that fossil fuels has to go. And that includes, the big oil producing nations of the planet that would be sort of less incentivized to do so.
So what did countries actually agree to? Did some of them set timelines? And is there anything that actually makes them follow that?
So there is these like nationally determined contributions. So all countries have sort of their own individual timelines for when to phase out, fossil fuels. So it could be, 2050, for instance, is like very, very common, but also some less ambitious countries have 2060 and 2070. However, when it comes to, enforcement of these NDCs, there are no like real enforcement mechanisms. And I think that is generally like a problem in global governance, right? I mean, we can write international legal frameworks all day we want, but it's very hard to enforce those frameworks in general because there is, anarchy on the international arena. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that, later on in the conversation.
But do you think the agreement will actually cause positive effects? Or do you think it sort of will end up not mattering because countries that want to do it will do it anyway, regardless of the agreement, and those that didn't want to do it are just going to renege on the agreement?
So I think it will cause positive effects, and it's already causing positive effects. So it sort of sends signals for, capital flows to be invested in, green technologies. It sends, signals like even countries like Saudi Arabia are like massively trying to decouple from fossil fuels because they understand that it will not be sustainable in the future. And I think especially the interesting part that I'm very passionate about is the signals that it sends in value chains. So if you have, big countries like, the European, US economies that are committed to net zero, then the companies within the jurisdiction of those countries needs to go to net zero as well. But the way for them to go to net zero, because on average 90% of their emissions are located in their supply chains and value chains. So that's like the producers in, let's say India or China or mostly, Asian countries. They need to push those suppliers to go net zero as well. So it becomes sort of this almost network effect from the top down that has been quite impactful. I mean, obviously we're massively behind the climate targets, but I think if you sort of imagine a world where none of those treaties would exist, I'm pretty sure we would be even more behind.
Are you optimistic on climate? Like, do you think that, assuming that nothing else destroys the world, are you optimistic that humans will be able to avoid major climate disasters?
No, I have to admit that I'm not particularly optimistic. I think the main way to actually solve it would be through technology. And, let's say, for instance, that we succeed building aligned artificial intelligence, then I think solving climate change will be a lot easier. I mean, like a lot of interventions that are incredibly hard to implement because they have like a quite bad cost curve in general, like for instance planting trees, will be massively easier with artificial intelligence. I mean, you could imagine like a whole swarm of autonomous robots, like more or less planting trees in deserts, and that way like get, massive amount of carbon emissions being sucked out of the atmosphere, to just like mention one example. But, surely there will be like breakthroughs in fusion with the help of artificial intelligence and other alternative types of energies.
I've felt for quite a while that there are only 3 realistic strategies for climate. I'm just curious if you disagree with me. The first being government collaboration. Like if you could really get the major countries, governments all collaborating, like it's within the power of the governments to greatly reduce carbon emission and turn things around if there's enough political will. So that's like strategy one. Strategy two is technology, which is just basically like if you could make it so it's in people's self-interest not to pollute, or the kind of technologies you're talking about where it just becomes much easier to do carbon capture. And then strategy three would be if there could somehow be enough pressure on corporations so that, because my understanding is there's a relatively small number of corporations, like in the hundreds, that do most of the polluting. So if there could be enough pressure put on them, then maybe that could make a huge difference. But other than that, I don't really see any viable strategy. What do you think about that?
I would agree with that. And I think they're sort of interdependent on one another. So, I mean, for instance, if countries can cooperate and sort of double down on net zero, that means often, doubling down on investing in new technologies that, companies within those countries can develop. So, I mean, for instance, like the reason why solar is so cheap right now is that Germany decided like many decades ago to pour billions into solar R&D and massively subsidize it. And then eventually like you reached a scale of innovation where it became like more cost effective. And then China actually turned out to do the same thing. And now like solar is cheaper than fossil fuels in most places around the world. So that was a result of like government sort of doubling down to invest in innovation. And then I think if you pressure like corporations, you can also get a bit of a incentive to adopt innovations early on. So I mean, for instance, a lot of trucking companies or car manufacturers were sort of, pressured to develop like electric models, both from the public, but then eventually by their investors, because it became sort of the new hype. So I think all of those three interventions are somewhat interconnected.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So did you then sour on climate as a cause, or did you just think that over time AI was a better use of your time? Can you tell us about that story of how you decided to transition?
So I've been interested in artificial intelligence, safety and governance for a really long time. I first got into it back in 2008. And my first sort of real job after graduating was working at the Future of Humanity Institute, like back in 2013-14. So that was when Nick worked on superintelligence. And I think like one of the reasons why I left the AI safety domain is that, whenever we talked about it, the media published, articles with like big pictures of Terminators, and it was almost like a joke to people. It was, this sci-fi thing that people didn't take seriously. So I felt like it was very hard to get traction on global coordination around AI, because again, it's one of those problems that you need global coordination on, because if one country defects and develops like dangerous artificial and superintelligence anyways, then, it really doesn't matter. So there needs to be a global governance regime. And I felt like it was impossible to sort of lobby for that back in the days. So then I felt like I sort of wanted to crack the code on global coordination and governance in climate. But then when the sort of ChatGPT moment happened, I started to look at AI again, because obviously it's a lot easier to convince people to take it seriously when there is like examples out there of AI clearly being very intelligent.
Shifting topics a bit, and then we'll bring it back to AI in a few minutes. What is our Darwinian trap?
So the book that I published is called The Darwinian Trap. And within that book, I have this concept called a Darwinian demon that the book revolves around. And a Darwinian demon is essentially defined as a selection pressure for an agent to behave in a way that is bad for others, essentially.
Could you give an example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's so many examples out there. Like the most obvious sort of in nature is being a predator, I mean, that's a strategy where it maximizes your own survival, but at the expense of, maybe eating someone else alive. And for that other animal, it's probably, extremely painful. But also in nature, like, cancer is another example of that. Cancer cells, I mean, in the short run, it might be adaptive to replicate as quickly as possible as a cancer cell, but you end up destroying like the host organism. And viruses are examples of that as well. But we see the same thing in our societies. So it might, corporations that are incentivized to seek like short-term profit at the expense of the environment or people's health, or right now when we talk about artificial intelligence, even at the expense of all future life on this planet.
Just to get really clear on this concept, if we imagine evolution and we think of it for a moment as having the goal of species survival or gene survival, maybe is an even more accurate way to say it, one way to do that is to increase the fitness of this creature at the expense of other creatures, right? Like a predator becomes better at hunting and then it kills more other creatures, but it survives better, right? Another way to do that is to do it in a way that's either neutral or even helpful to other creatures, right? So for example, making a mutation in a gene that makes it more symbiotic with other creatures or makes it cooperate better with other creatures, but that actually could benefit both it and other creatures. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And in the book, I call this selection pressure to actually, for mutually beneficial cooperation, I call that Darwinian angels. And those examples exist like all in our natural world. I mean, as a matter of fact, everything that is beautiful in this world is sort of layers upon layers of cooperation. I mean, cooperating molecules, creating a metabolism, cooperating genes, creating a genome, cooperating cells, creating you and me and us cooperating, creating, societies and economies and so on. So it's layers upon layers of cooperation. So you can sort of see all of life as this tug of war between, the forces of defection, the demons, and the forces of cooperation, the angels.
You also brought in this idea a moment ago of short-term versus long-term. It seems to me that's not quite the same thing, because you could have a Darwinian demon where a creature gains fitness by harming other creatures, but it could still be beneficial for the long-term survival of its own group. Maybe they're taking advantage of prey and it's worse for the prey, but maybe their own group actually is benefited. And so it's not necessarily a short-term strategy as long as it doesn't wipe the prey out to extinction. Then, of course, it would be short-term because then maybe that whole group would eventually go extinct.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And I think this actually goes to the crux of the problem, because natural selection is sort of an optimization algorithm that can't make long-term predictions. So it essentially only knows that, a particular mutation will be adaptive from one generation to another. So it can almost only sort of sense the slope or the gradient of the fitness landscape, but it will not be able to predict like the long-term consequences of a mutation. So I mean, in biology, there is this concept of kamikaze genes or evolutionary suicide. So I mean, one example of that would, for instance, be, predators that might have a mutation where they become so successful at hunting prey. Maybe they become like super fast or something, but they become so successful so they hunt all of the prey to extinction and then they go extinct themselves. But there is no way for evolution through natural selection to know that this gene that is super successful to begin with will be less successful in the long run. And I think to some degree that's what is going on with our societies as well, where, in the short term it might be adaptive for, particular countries to be very exploitative in terms of resource extraction or building more and more dangerous weapons. But in the long term, it might actually cause us to go extinct.
Obviously, it's tempting to personify evolution, right? It's easier to talk about, like it has a goal of optimizing fitness. But really, essentially, all it's doing is there's random mutations, then there's natural selection, which causes some creatures to die and some to live. And then those that die off, well, their genes get replicated less. And those that live long enough to breed, they get replicated more. And that kind of spreads their genes. And I mean, I think your argument is that at the very short term, this is optimizing for, survival into the next generation, right? It's not taking into account whether the whole species gets wiped out. But if you actually step back, you take a bird's eye view, you could say, well, maybe it is also optimizing for long term, because those groups that end up getting genes that cause them to wipe themselves out, on the longer time scale, they do get wiped out through the process of natural selection. Eventually, they do get wiped out of the gene pool. And, there's this whole concept of group selection, which was controversial in the field. But I think that a lot of people in evolutionary biology, as far as I understand it, do believe in group selection, that there is some kind of selection pressure at the level of groups and not just at the individual.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think you're right about that. And sort of all of the examples that I gave before of sort of this major evolutionary transitions going from cooperating molecules to sort of a cell and like groups of cells out competing sort of lonely cells and then eventually creating organisms. Those are all sort of examples of some sort of cooperative selection, and there's like 5 categories of them. Group selection is one, but there's also kin selection, direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, and network selection, and they all sort of work in slightly similar ways. But I think the problem here is that now, especially, but maybe even in our evolutionary past, there might have been mutations that lead to the extinction of everything on the planet. So if you look at past mass extinctions, arguably 5 out of 6 of them were caused by, algae or bacteria replicating super aggressively and then causing, climate change that almost killed everyone. So I think from a cosmic perspective, you might be right, like out there might be, one Earth-like planet where everything went right and we all learn how to sort of cooperate. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, it will happen on this planet, if that makes sense.
Do you have an idea for a digital product that could improve the world? Are you frustrated by cookie-cutter survey platforms that don't give you the level of personalization you need for your research content? GuidedTrack might be what you're looking for. GuidedTrack will empower you to effortlessly create and launch apps, surveys, educational modules, prototypes, and online tools, even if you have no programming experience. From Ayla's famous kink survey to the quiz called Can You Guess Which Studies Replicate, made by 80,000 Hours, GuidedTrack's easy-to-use platform and flexible interface has enabled some of the most creative people and organizations to bring their impactful ideas to life. In fact, it's what we've used to build all 70 of Clearer Thinking's interactive digital tools. To make it even easier for you to embark on your next project, we've recently launched 10 free templates. Simply choose the template that aligns best with your goals and customize the content as needed. But you want to know what the best part is? GuidedTrack is completely free to use. So visit guidedtrack.com to sign up for your free account and start making your next big thing.
So to break down what you're saying, if there are group selection forces at sort of an intermediate level, you have a bunch of groups that are competing. There will be forces that cause one group to survive, the other groups to die, and that does create sort of an evolutionary pressure. But if the consequences are so great where all groups die, then in fact, in some sense, there isn't any pressure because it just sort of ends everything, and you just can't sustain events like that even once.
Exactly, and I think the most mind-blowing things that changed my thinking around this was like 15 years ago when I started to play around with evolutionary simulations. So at the time, I just wanted to become a better Python programmer and like played around with these evolutionary simulations of predator-prey dynamics, like virus-host dynamics. And what tend to happen in all of those simulations is that life all died out because the predators became too successful in a way, and they killed all prey and then died as a result. And then I sort of got obsessed with this idea of why is that? And then I found these concepts of evolutionary suicide. And I mean, if you look throughout our evolutionary history, there are sort of a lot of points where we could have gone extinct. So sort of imagine when life was confined to these like thermal vents on the ocean floor, like a very successful predator back then before life had the chance to diversify could potentially have sort of ended all life. And then after life even got diversified, like all life has some sort of metabolism, meaning that we take in material that we convert to energy, and then we create waste of some sort. But, that waste might be toxic for others. So we have had these examples of very successful bacteria and algae, like creating climate change because they toxified the ocean, almost destroying all life. So I think there might be sort of, and I think one like mental model of this is that you could sort of imagine life on this earth as sort of a random walk throughout like a fitness landscape. And in that fitness landscape, there might be, landmines, but we will never be born on a planet where we stepped on the landmine. So I actually think that, life is just incredibly fragile, and I call that the fragility of life hypothesis. And I think we might have been just very lucky for 4 billion years or so.
Right. So you might be proposing a kind of anthropic kind of principle where complex, intelligent life will never find itself on a planet where early life got wiped out, right? Because if it had gotten wiped out, they just wouldn't be there. And so any intelligent life looking back is going to say, look, life survived all this way. It never got wiped out. Maybe it came close a few times to getting wiped out, and maybe it had these major resets, but it never got wiped out. But then it's like, well, but what can you really conclude from that? Because of course, if it had been wiped out, you wouldn't be there to reason about it.
That's exactly it. And I mean, in sort of thinking about alien life, there's this concept of a great filter. I mean, is there a filter throughout, our evolutionary history that wipes everything out? It might be that, or makes it just incredibly hard to create complex life to begin with. I mean, it could be that, creating the eukaryotic cell that enables multicellular organism is just incredibly hard, and that's why we don't see aliens when we look out in the night sky. Or it might be that later on, when they become intelligent, they tend to destroy themselves. But I think the idea of Darwinian demons sort of offers an alternative where actually the whole thing is just a great filter, because evolution through natural selection can't think of long-term consequences. So it might end up mutating in a way that is essentially like a landmine, like the examples that I provided earlier.
Right. So it acts as a short-term filter at the level of species or genes, and maybe it acts as a medium-term filter at the level of groups, but not a long-term filter at the level of like all life or most species or something like that.
Yeah.
So when we apply this to society, right? Because I think in part you want to use this as a kind of motivating framework to think about society today. How do you make that application?
So you can sort of do it in your everyday life in a sense, right? Like you can look at from a framework of natural selection in a way when you look at why do some colleagues that are really bad get promoted? Well, it might be because there's not necessarily sort of a selection pressure for competency. Like one way to sort of hack the system might be to just like nag your boss and become friends with your boss, and therefore you get promoted, but not because of skills. So there's like the everyday situations that I talk about, and they cover like everything from, fake news and corporate greed in Wall Street. But then there is also the bigger picture things. And maybe we can, talk about both of those categories. But the bigger picture things are like the arms races between corporations and nation states, where, in order to win as a civilization, you need to extract resources sort of quicker than anyone else, because then you can have a more powerful economy. But with finite resources, it creates a selection pressure for more and more dangerous weapons. But in order to create more and more dangerous weapons and more advanced economies, there is also this selection pressure for intelligence that, enabled public education, but is now powering the artificial intelligence arms race, because with more intelligence, you can invent better strategies to sort of compete on the international arena.
In order to be able to apply these ideas from evolution to something in society, my understanding is you need at least 3 components. You need some unit of information that gets copied. You need some form of mutation or changes to the copies. And you need some kind of selection where some copies are surviving and some are not. And if you have those three things, you can really use kind of the evolutionary thinking that we use for genes and species. And so you mentioned companies, and you could see how this could apply to companies, because companies, well, they have different kinds of information that might get copied. Maybe they have what kind of business they're in could get copied. Maybe their culture could get copied. Then you could see that there's some kind of replication mechanism, like other companies can crop up that try to copy them. And then there's a filtering mechanism. Some of them go out of business and some don't. Also, people can leave the company, but like bring aspects of it to a new company or start a new company. And so you can kind of see all three of those forces. So do you think we can kind of literally apply evolutionary thinking to companies?
I think we can, because of the reasons that you mentioned. And I'm really glad that you asked that question to get a bit more rigor here. So I mean, the unit here is sort of almost a unit of culture, or I guess like what Richard Dawkins would call a meme. And that meme can sort of spread like orally, like sort of a business culture. But I think the most common way when it comes to countries and companies, in companies you sort of have these strategy documents, right? Like, how are you supposed to behave? And I mean, look at the social media landscape, for instance. You know, one strategy might be pay per click. That's how you make money. And then other companies decide to sort of copy that model because it turns out to be successful. And similarly, like when it comes to countries, for instance, you know, laws and the legal system can be such examples. And for instance, all countries on the planet sort of recognize legal persons, so like corporations, as these entities, and also recognize shares within these entities as some sort of capital. So you can have sort of this evolution happening on a corporate and company level through these sort of strategic or legal documents, more or less.
And if we apply those same ideas to, let's say, academia, you could also see how you might have those three things. You can have sort of a unit of information, which could be like, it could be a culture of how you do research or what topics you study or the methods you use. And then you could see a copying because you've got, you know, advisors, they're going to train the kind of the next generation, and that's going to kind of spread those ideas. And then you have selection, which is who gets to stay in the field, like who gets tenure, who gets published in top journals. So it seems like a kind of natural fit there as well.
Exactly. And this is where I think like a concept called Goodhart's law can be sort of quite useful, because in many fields and in many occupations, there's sort of a definition of success or a way to measure success. And in academia, for instance, a way to measure success might be, you know, the age index or number of citations. And the age index is essentially like a fancy way of calculating how impactful a researcher has been based on their publications and the number of citations from those publications. But what Goodhart's law states is that whenever a metric becomes widely used, there is like ways to sort of hack that metric. And it might actually be adaptive, if you look at it from a natural selection perspective, to find new and creative ways to hack that metric. So if you look in academia, for instance, like we're seeing a replication crisis, and a lot of that is people engaging in so-called p-value hacking. So you essentially like slice the data in a way to yield a statistically significant result, even though it's useless. But also we have seen like a lot of cases of fraud where people actually use Photoshop on images and so on. And once that sort of spreads and you have to compete with others that don't follow the rules, like it's almost like you're forced into fudging the numbers and hacking the metric yourself if you're a researcher and you want that limited grant money.
Right. If the way that people were promoted or got tenure was more of a kind of broad measure of like, well, how good is the science they're really doing? How high quality is it? Then it would be a lot harder to hack. But if it's literally like count up number of papers in top journals, then it becomes a game that you can optimize to, and you can find ways to kind of technically get those papers, even if you're not producing high quality science.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's apply this to AI in particular. What do you see as kind of the clearest way of applying it?
So there is like multiple ways of applying it. Like one that I'm fascinated about is the arms race between AI companies, because we're in this like incredibly unique situation where the CEOs of all of the big AI labs, so Google DeepMind, Anthropic, and OpenAI, have all talked about the existential risks of the technologies that they're developing. So approximately 2 years ago, they all signed a statement saying that, AI is an existential risk equivalent to nuclear weapons and pandemics. But roughly the same time, there was this other open statement that we should pause AI development, but none of the CEOs signed that statement. So it's sort of this weird situation where they all realize that the technologies that they're developing might have an existential risk, but they're not willing to pause. And I think it's again back to the type of arms race dynamic where if you actually decide to pause, then the other people will win the arms race. So then you're incentivized not to pause. And I think there is a level of rationalization as well, where everyone thinks that they are the good guys. So if they have to do less safety testing as they're releasing new models, it's actually for good. Because if they do less safety testing, then they are more likely to win. And obviously they're the good guys, so they should win.
And can you just kind of tie that together with what we've been discussing in terms of kind of applying evolutionary thinking?
How I would apply the concept of Darwinian demons on the AI arms race is that there are sort of financial selection pressures that, in order to win, you need access to capital, you need access to talent. And if you, for instance, decide to pause, then you're less likely to get access to talent and capital in the end of the day. So it means that, there is a selection pressure for creating more fancy, products that users will use in the end of the day.
Right. I mean, you would, if you had a company that was like, oh, we're just going to focus on making our AI safe, we're not going to focus on sort of making money or growing, it might be harder for them to get capital and then like actually might get outcompeted.
Yes, exactly. And I think we have sort of seen a little bit of that in action, right? With, OpenAI deciding to create the for-profit entity to raise a bunch of money. And then we had the whole drama around the board actually firing the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, because they were concerned with the fact that he apparently wasn't completely honest with the board, and that had, implications on safety. So the board was actually assigned to sort of safeguard the mission of OpenAI, which is for AI to benefit all of humanity. But, in the end of the day, they need money to run the operations, and all of their money came from Microsoft. So OpenAI, or Sam Altman, when he got fired, ended up just going to Microsoft and told them and all of the employees of OpenAI that, either you let me stay or I will bring all of the best employees with me to Microsoft, because that's where all of the money exists. So I think it's an example of how money wins in the end of the day.
So do you see AI as a more important or more pressing cause area than climate now?
I do see AI as more pressing, and I think I've always seen AI as more pressing, at least sort of intellectually, because it will be one of those transformative technologies. But what I didn't expect is that it would be so fast. Like my sort of predictions for when we would have AI that is as smart as we have now is maybe more than 10 years in the future, so like 2035. So I think AI is more important.
And can you elaborate on why you think it's more important?
I think AI is actually the most important thing because it is, in a sense, the ultimate dual-use technology, meaning that it can be used for both good and bad. So artificial intelligence, just like human intelligence, can be used to create like nuclear energy that is cheap and clean, but it can also be used to create nuclear weapons. And I think what AI will enable is a whole host of new technologies being unlocked. And all of those new technologies might create an arms race in and of themselves. So one example that I bring up in the book is the technology of engineered pandemics or weaponized pandemics. So you could, for instance, imagine that with the help of artificial intelligence, you could take a virus like rabies, which has a lethality of like 100%. I mean, if you get it and it spreads to your body, you're more or less guaranteed to die. But what if you can make rabies airborne? And what if you can make it have the incubation period of hepatitis B, which is 10 months, meaning that it can spread out throughout the population for 10 months, and you will not know that you have it until people start dying like flies? And what if you can furthermore engineer it to only target specific ethnicities, for instance? So all of these things could be possible in principle with the help of artificial intelligence. And as we know from the race towards nuclear weapons, as it's brilliantly depicted in the movie Oppenheimer, once you have this arms race dynamic, you almost don't have a choice. If you're concerned that China is going to develop this technology, for instance, the US will be incentivized to race to that technology first. And I think AI will unlock a whole host of such technologies in the technology tree.
What work is AI doing there, right? So if we're saying AI is going to make this more dangerous, people might think, well, it's already getting more dangerous every year as biology knowledge increases and scientific understanding of gene editing increases, right? The kinds of risks you're talking about are already becoming more and more likely. So why does AI matter in that equation?
I think AI matters in that equation because it will be a lot easier with the help of AI technology to figure out like what genes are doing what specifically. And of course, it's not AI alone. I mean, you need to have, some sort of information feedback loop where, for instance, you can, through the help of CRISPR, try different, genetic combinations and see how the specific genetic combinations affect what proteins are being produced, like the morphology or behavior of a particular virus. But I think like that loop can more or less be automated with AI. So we can have like very quick feedback loops in terms of what genes are doing what specific things. And then AI is this pattern matching machine. So if you just have enough data, AI can figure out like what genes and what DNA sequences are responsible for what.
So then is the concern that AI will accelerate these kinds of arm races, and then one of these arm races will like end the species or destroy human civilization?
That's exactly it. And it will create not just one of those arms races, but a ton of those arms races simultaneously. I mean, similar to our increased understanding of, the quantum realm created the arms race of atomic weapons.
Could the act of answering open-ended questions about yourself give you new, important insights? It turns out the answer is yes, if those questions are selected in just the right way. After running a series of 5 scientific studies, Clearer Thinking has discovered a specific set of practical, yet rarely asked questions that 83% of people reported were valuable for them to answer, and 78% said they would recommend to others. A remarkably high 88% of people even reported that they enjoyed answering these questions. And Clearer Thinking is now making those questions available to you for free on clearerthinking.org so that you can benefit from them as well. You can also order a beautiful physical card deck of the life-changing questions so that you can use the questions to bond with friends and family. We think you'll be surprised at just how valuable answering these open-ended questions about yourself can be. To answer the free life-changing questions or to find Clearer Thinking's other free tools and mini-courses, head to clearerthinking.org.
Give us another example of an arms race that AI might create that's not biological.
So there is, of course, like other domains of weapons manufacturing that could be enabled by AI. Like one thing that some people are talking about is the worry of atomic precise manufacturing. And I mean, this is not my sort of domain of expertise, so I wouldn't be able to tell you like exactly how AI will help with atomic precise manufacturing, but I'm sure that, you know, others who are experts would be able to go into the details. But I mean, the idea here is that, you know, with the help of artificial intelligence, we could be better at sort of mastering like very, very small scale production. So then you could, for instance, create like almost this mist of small nanobots that could be spread and enter into like people's bloodstream when you breathe them in, and create like all sorts of problems. So that's like another weapons example. But I think there's also like a lot of examples in the non-weapons or non-misuse domain that I'm happy to talk about as well.
Sure, what's one of those?
So I think one of those would be gradual disempowerment of humans. So it wouldn't be like this one weapon that wipes us all out, but it would actually be sort of more of a gradual replacement of humans. So I think the whole idea here is that in general, like there's very few examples of a more intelligent species being dominated by a less intelligent species. And if you look from the perspective of Darwinian demons again, there will, you know, be a selection pressure for countries and corporations to just outsource more and more of their labor, but also decision making to artificial intelligence. So you could sort of imagine a future where like you will have like AI CEOs, or you might still have human CEOs, but you will have AI advisors that are the real decision makers behind all decisions. And similarly, like you will have AI advisors to politicians telling them exactly what to do, or AI advisors to military leaders. So then it's almost like this co-evolution where we're voluntarily giving up more and more power to the artificial intelligence systems, and we're building like a society around the incentives of, you know, corporations and countries instead of the incentives of human beings. And I think the main sort of point here is that if you look at the most evil cooperations or the most oppressive dictatorial regimes, they at least need to care about human welfare and well-being minimally, because they're dependent on human labor to stay in power and to be profitable. But with artificial intelligence, they might not be dependent on human labor anymore whatsoever. They can directly convert capital into compute that is used to run AI models that create like the economic value that they desire, essentially. And humans will not need to be around anymore. So we will sort of be a little bit like, I guess, rats in a big city. I mean, there might be some wealth trickling down to us, but, you know, a cityscape to the rats are like entirely foreign to them, and they have no control over it. And similarly, we might, you know, live in a society that is not controlled by us and utterly alien to us.
So is the key to that argument that if companies and countries increasingly depend on AI labor rather than human labor, that essentially allows them to be more detached from producing human values and less bound to doing what people want?
Yes, that's exactly it. I mean, there is less incentives for them to care about what the human wants in the end of the day.
So are you more concerned about these kinds of scenarios you just described of companies and countries being less tied down to actually caring about people's values than you are about kind of loss of control scenarios where eventually people build a kind of super intelligent AI and they lose the ability to actually control it?
Yeah, I'm more concerned about those like slow takeoff evolution scenarios that I just mentioned than the loss of control scenario. I mean, I might change my mind about that in the future, but right now it seems like we need like exponentially more compute to make the AI models smarter, which seems to sort of indicate more of a slow takeoff. But also, like, these things can move really fast. Like, I would not be too surprised if we have some sort of algorithmic breakthrough where all of a sudden an AI model can recursively self-improve itself and make itself like a lot more effective. I mean, for instance, some paradigms of AI safety, such as mechanistic interpretability, where you actually try to figure out, like, on an artificial neuron level, what is going on. Such approaches could lead to an AI essentially knowing how its own brain works and then just upgrade that brain rapidly. So I think both those scenarios are really scary, but right now I'm worrying about the sort of slow takeoff, gradual disempowerment scenario a little bit more.
Just because you think it's more likely to occur?
Exactly, because I think it's more likely to occur. But I think it's important that regardless of which scenario is true, like, we need to govern this technology globally, and the sort of mechanisms for governance are quite similar. I think we need to keep track of where all of the big AI chips are and who has access to this technology, and we need to be careful about, the approach that we have to artificial intelligence, where we don't build AI models where it's impossible for us to know exactly what they will do, but we might have more of a symbolic approach to AI where we can use mathematical proofs to figure out like what actions it's likely to take and so on. So I think the solutions are roughly the same for all of those worries, and we should strive towards those technical solutions and governance, regardless which one we happen to worry about the most, which scenario.
And what would you say to a listener that thinks, well, AI is just another technology? We've seen lots of technologies that have made things faster and easier and cheaper to do, have enabled us to do more and more things, have even made weapons more viable. Like, what's so special about AI?
So I think AI is more special because it's essentially a meta technology in a way. Like, I mean, what enabled all previous technologies is our intelligence, but our intelligence is fundamentally bounded. I mean, to create the atomic bomb, we had to gather the most brilliant physicists alive in the last century. And the result was the atomic bomb. But if you can build AI that is smarter than humans, it's not just like a specific technology. I mean, it's not like, a car or a vacuum cleaner that only has one particular purpose. Is really this sort of meta technology that can enable like innovations across all possible fields, which fundamentally means that it can be weaponized.
You might argue that electricity and the internet were both meta technologies of the same form. Do you think that there are traits that AI has that make it fundamentally different from those as well?
So I think both internet and technology and electricity were tools, right? I mean, electricity, of course, you can, with electricity, you can power like motors that will make our labor a lot more efficient, like manual labor. And the internet made, communication a lot faster. But intelligence is, I think, a completely different thing, because then we're talking about like fundamental cognition and intelligence. Or at least my favorite definition of intelligence is that it is like an agent's capability of achieving whatever their goal is in multiple different environments, which essentially means that if you're more intelligent, you're not just better in chess, or you're not just better in physics, you're like better across the board at everything. And obviously, you can use that to develop new drugs and solve climate change and all of these different problems, or you could use them to create new and dangerous weapons. And which one it is depends on the incentives that we have in our society. And I think right now, at least to me, it's clear that we're sort of driving towards a cliff, but we're driving in this like old sedan that is really slow. But with artificial intelligence, we're upgrading that old sedan to a Ferrari.
What would global governance look like for AI, right? Suppose that you're trying to make the world safer from AI. What can you actually even govern?
So a lot of people have said, and I think rightfully so, that artificial intelligence might be incredibly hard to govern because it's software in the end of the day. And I mean, software can easily be copied. It's a huge problem. However, like in order to train these hugely intelligent AI models, you need a whole data center of AI chips or so-called GPUs. So look at, for instance, xAI's latest model. That was 100,000 of these like really expensive NVIDIA GPUs. So that could actually be a tractable way of governing artificial intelligence, because it's more or less only two companies that design these chips that you need to create AI, and they're all manufactured in one factory in Taiwan called TSMC, and they all use lithography machines from this like Dutch company. So you have this enormous concentration in the AI value chain, and each point in that value chain is a potential governance node. And I think the most compelling one is compute. So you could actually build into the hardware, the chips, mechanisms whereby you're not allowed to train an AI model without certain evaluations that it's not going to be dangerous, for instance. So you could build the chips in such a way that they will reject the training of the AI in the first place unless you can prove that the AI will be safe.
How would that work in practice? Like, what would the chips actually be checking, and how would they get kind of approved to continue training?
So that's a great question. This is something that actually my current company, Lucid Computing, is working on. And it is like a tough problem. And I think it's especially tough with the current paradigm of artificial intelligence, because when you train a big neural network, it's actually like more or less impossible to know exactly what it will do. So I think fundamentally we would need to change our approach to artificial intelligence, where instead of building these general intelligences that are brilliant in all domains, we build tools that are brilliant in specific domains. So for instance, like a chess engine being brilliant at chess but nothing else, or AlphaFold being brilliant at protein folding, meaning that we can discover a bunch of new drugs as a result. So I think we need to change our approach to AI development, and you could sort of build these tiny computer programs that you could run inside of the chip in something called the trusted execution environment that can essentially test that, the AI is being trained using a particular paradigm, for instance. So at least in theory, that would be possible.
Is that really realistic at this point, though? I mean, the genie's kind of out of the bottle. Like, all these companies are making large language models, they're open source large language models. Like, these are kind of pretty fundamentally generalist technologies where you can chat with them about your medical problems, or you can ask them to solve a math problem, or you can, get them to write an essay.
I don't think it is realistic at this moment in time. And that is why with my current company, we're focusing on a specific sub-problem, which is actually like, where are the chips located, to make sure that the chips are not in China or Iran or any dictatorial regimes, or no terrorist groups have access to them. So I mean, that is a more tractable problem at the moment. However, I think these things will change over time. And unfortunately, I think the only way to make incentives aligned for a completely different approach to artificial intelligence would be us being close to a major catastrophe. So for instance, when Soviet Union and the US had their power struggle, there were incidents such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were very close to World War III. And when you're really close to World War III, then you really have no choice. Like either you cooperate or you enter into the world war and a bunch of people will die in that war. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the Soviet Union decided that the US would withdraw a lot of their missiles, nuclear weapons from Turkey. The Soviets would not put nuclear weapons in Cuba. So they reached an agreement. And I think there might be a point in time where the great power conflict between China and the US reaches sort of that tipping point where either we cooperate around the governance of this technology or there is hell to pay in a next world war.
And suppose that we don't get to that point where, war is imminent and therefore suddenly there's a will to kind of control things a lot more. How do we get the world to come around or the governments to come around to actually putting in place some kind of regulation that helps protect things?
So I think, for instance, the US at the moment have a lot of power to use export controls on other countries across the world to incentivize these types of investments. So for instance, the US can say that, you're not going to get access to all of these chips in your big data center in the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia unless you can track where the chips are and unless you can track that the chips are not being used to train like a artificial superintelligence that is unlicensed in some way. So that could be sort of a more tractable short way of doing things. But for instance, that will not be applicable to China. I mean, China is already cut off from US advanced AI chips. And as a result, they are now racing to create their completely independent semiconductor value chain. So I think at some point it has to become international, but I think you could sort of do it step by step, starting with export controls. And then eventually when the world is sort of ready and we have taken the arms race too far, like the right technologies will exist in the world because they have been used for export controls and then they can be used for more global governance.
Many of these challenges you're talking about seem quite daunting because it seems like there's local incentives to do things that kind of make things riskier and riskier rather than incentives to make things safer and safer, right? Like if every company makes more money by making the best, most effective AIs, then that kind of just pushes everything forward, faster and faster. And if it really requires a lot of global coordination to kind of monitor things more carefully, well, we know coordination is difficult and it's like often very, very hard to do this. So I'm wondering overall, do you feel pessimistic about the situation or do you think it's optimistic, like that we'll actually be able to make these technologies safer?
Yeah, like honestly, it fluctuates for me like day to day, whether I feel pessimistic and optimistic. And I think like one part of me feels like incredibly optimistic. I feel like we're making a lot of progress on this problem. More politicians than ever before understand the problem. Like people start to understand the problem. Like whenever I go abroad and take a cab, like I tend to ask the cab driver about artificial intelligence. And it's like clear that, people, like everyday people are getting more and more educated. So personally, like I actually don't feel, afraid. I don't feel doom and gloom on an emotional level. I'm incredibly optimistic. But then if I take a step back and try to look at things more objectively, it is sometimes hard not to be a pessimist. Because going back to what we talked about earlier, like survivorship bias and the entropic principle, I think life has sort of this tendency to self-destruct. And I mean, if you sort of look out throughout the universe, despite there being probably like millions of potentially habitable planets in our galaxy. We don't seem to see life anywhere, as it seems to be this like very unstable thing. So maybe we will sort of self-destruct, but certainly on an emotional level, I feel more optimistic than pessimistic.
So your solution to why, when we look at the universe, we don't see it teeming with technologically advanced life is just that life wipes itself out too quickly?
That's what I think. I mean, as I said earlier about the great filter, I think it's just like a continuous filter. It's not just one filter. I think it's just that, throughout evolution, through natural selection, there could be mutations that are beneficial in the short run, but will wipe us out in the long run. And such a quote-unquote mutation could be the invention of artificial intelligence, but it could also be the invention of a super virus or the invention of a bunch of other things. And Nick Bostrom has this analogy in his paper, The Vulnerable World Hypothesis, that every technology is like almost like taking this random ball from an urn, and a black ball might be like a civilization destroying technology, and whenever there is a mutation, it is almost like playing that game of taking that ball from the urn. And with AI, there will be a lot of new balls. It's almost like AI will create this entirely new urn of technologies that we could have never dreamed of.
If the main dangers from AI are literal destruction of civilization or death of all life on Earth, and the AI ceases to exist, then that could be a partial explanation for the Fermi paradox. But if the AI would then continue to exist and continue to develop and expand, it doesn't really explain things, if that makes sense, right? So even if AI wiped all life on Earth out, but if the AIs continue to build, then then it raises another question. Why don't you see sort of AIs out there in the universe doing lots of stuff?
Yeah, and I think the answer there is probably that, none of the other planets that had life got far enough to get to artificial intelligence. Like they self-destructed like way earlier than that. So it could be, the examples that I had earlier with, bacteria replicating so rapidly that it causes climate change, or acidification of oceans that sort of, kills all life, for instance, or, super predators when when life was confined to these thermal vents in the ocean floor. So I think, life probably self-destructed before we had AIs to begin with, because as you rightly point out, if AI is successful, it can sort of spread throughout the galaxy. Like actually colonizing the whole galaxy would only take a couple of million years. And I mean, life on Earth has existed for 4 billion years. So we should, probably see a bunch of, AI alien structures out there in the whole of the Milky Way galaxy. But the reason why we don't see that is probably that life self-destructed before that point in all of those other planets.
I suppose if there were many civilizations out there in the universe that created AI and got wiped out, there could, for some reason that we don't understand, be a reason why AI tends to not explore. It just kind of sits on that planet, does its thing, rather than kind of spreading throughout the galaxy. I don't know why that would be, but perhaps that's another explanation.
Yeah, it could be. And I think also what I suspect is that in general, there will be some almost cosmic selection pressure to evolve like really slowly. So I mean, if you sort of have this mental model again of life as this random walk throughout the fitness landscape, and in some places in the fitness landscape, there will be these life-ending mutations that you could illustrate as a landmine in the landscape, then you will actually exist for longer if you move really slowly throughout that landscape, and you're like very, very careful about technological innovation. So I think if we sort of invent AI in the future, they might sort of realize that, we need to put a lot of resources into future predictions about the implications of technologies before we put those technologies in the world. So for instance, really advanced civilizations might realize that, researching this particular like quantum thing or whatever. Maybe there could be like very dangerous, life-threatening technologies coming out of that. So therefore we want to like make a bunch of predictions and just, spend a lot of resources on running like advanced simulations on the consequences of potential technologies before we put them out there in the world.
It seems that doing that kind of thing would require extremely good approaches to solving collective action problems and other kind of multipolar traps, because okay, maybe some group decides let's not build this technology because it's too risky, but then another group just builds it, right? Because they think that they estimate the risk as being less, or they're just less safety conscious, or there's just some local gain that they want to get, and so it's worth for them to take the risk.
Yes, and that gets me actually to the other part of my book where I talk about like solutions to these like multipolar traps or Darwinian demons, as I call them. And one such solution would be just like a very strong world government that can penalize any potential, defectors. So sort of more of a global police state. But then obviously with such a solution, you have like the risk of some sort of totalitarian lock-in where actually becomes this very dystopian totalitarian state that just monitors everything that you do in order to make sure that you don't create any existential risks and your freedoms are being taken away and so on. So in the book, I also discuss more, decentralized options to make that happen.
Yeah, so what are some of the decentralized options?
So I think the decentralized options are mainly based on the fact that our economies are incredibly interconnected. I have this example in the book of this guy on the internet that tried to create a chicken sandwich from scratch. And you might think that creating a chicken sandwich is easy. You just take the chicken from the fridge and the sandwich and then you make it. But by doing it from scratch, it means, growing grain, milling the grain, and doing all of that using more or less stone age technology, because again, you're not allowed to, trade with anyone else. So you can't buy like a fancy milling machine or whatever. And it took that guy like $1,500 and 6 months to do a chicken sandwich. And that just exemplifies how incredibly interconnected everything is. So when you talk about something like the semiconductor value chain and the AI value chain, there will be cooperation happening across so many different actors in the value chain. And if one of those actors decide to say, hey, like we think that this is a little bit dangerous, we are going to pull out from this, then the whole value chain would collapse. So I discuss some ways in which you could sort of, through the help of reputation and something called reputational markets, leverage that interconnectedness in value chains for more safety.
Right, because I suppose that if there's a kind of chain where a bunch of things have to happen to use this technology, then you could avoid the kind of multipolar trap by putting a bottleneck at some part of the chain and saying, well, like everything has to go through this bottleneck anyway, so you can't really act unilaterally unless you use this part of the chain that we can control.
Exactly. I mean, one way you could see it is that every essential part in the chain has a vote, in a sense. Like, do we want to do this or do we not want to do this? And when it comes to like creating dangerous artificial intelligence, you could leverage that vote to say, hey, I think this is dangerous, I don't want to do it. But that would require a lot more supply chain transparency than we have today, where actually, the creators of the chips will know that, upstream, when we sell those chips, they might be used for, dangerous things. So that is actually something that I discuss at length in the book, like how could we create more transparent value chains where every actor in the value chain could actually leverage their vote for good.
Before we wrap up, if there's one idea you want to leave the listener with, what would it be?
I think the one idea that I would leave the listener with is we need to change the narrative around our core problems. I think we have a name, shame, and blame type narrative where all of our problems is due to this particular corrupt politician or this particularly greedy CEO. And I think that narrative is not serving us because it's not getting into the root cause of the problem. So instead of hating the players, we need to hate the game, or perhaps even better, change the game.
Kristian, thanks for coming on.
Thanks a lot for having me, Spencer.
Thanks for joining us. We always love to hear from our audience, so if you have any questions or comments, send us an email at clearerthinkingpodcast@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Tone Support and transcribed by We Amplify. We would really appreciate it if you could rate and review us wherever you're listening to this, as it helps others find out about the show. And did you know you can now watch videos of the podcast? Just go to youtube.com/@clearerthinkingpodcast. Stay tuned in by subscribing to our email newsletter, One Helpful Idea. Each week, we'll send you one valuable idea that you can read about in just 30 seconds, along with that week's new podcast episode, an essay by Spencer, and announcements about upcoming events. To sign up for our newsletter, access transcripts, or learn more about our guests, visit podcast.clearerthinking.org. A listener asks, what have you identified as your intrinsic values? Which is the most important of them?
So I look at this through the lens of our intrinsic values test, where we catalog 22 categories of intrinsic values, but we also get into much more fine-grained ones. And a lot of my biggest intrinsic values are around happiness and suffering. And there's the happiness of suffering of beings broadly in the world, of the universe. There's the happiness and suffering of my loved ones. And then there's the happiness and suffering of myself. And I count those as different categories because I don't care about them all equally. Even if insects can suffer as much as a human, I care about my loved ones' happiness and suffering more than a random insect. In addition to those, I have strong intrinsic values related to truth, in terms of believing true things, in terms of not spreading falsehoods, and in terms of spreading truth. I also have some other intrinsic values like continuing to exist, taking actions that cause a positive impact on the world, and to some extent some around fairness as well.